The council in fear. The grand chamber of the Alien War Council was alive with light and sound. Thousands of glowing crystals pulsed across the curved walls, each carrying whispers of power and authority. The air itself hummed with tension, filled with the low voices of leaders who had ruled galaxies for ages. These were beings who commanded fleets, who could destroy worlds with a single order, and yet in this moment they were restless. The Supreme Overlord was dead, or so the rumors claimed. None in the chamber believed it. They argued loudly, their voices sharp, their words filled with denial. How could a single human defeat the one who ruled 1,000 systems? How could a fragile species, short-lived and weak, stand against the most feared being in the known stars? It was impossible, they said. A towering insectoid general slammed his claw against the stone table. Lies, he hissed. No human could ever challenge the Overlord. They are nothing but pests. His words were echoed by several others. Some shouted for war, others demanded silence. The noise grew like thunder, shaking the chamber itself. But then, without warning, the great doors at the far end of the hall groaned open. The sound cut through the chaos like a blade. Every council member turned, their voices fading. The chamber fell into a silence so heavy it felt like the weight of space pressing down on their chests. A lone figure stepped inside. His boots echoed against the polished floor. Step by step, the counselors leaned forward, their alien eyes narrowing in confusion and fear. The figure was human, just one man, dressed not in shining armor or royal robes, but in worn battle gear scarred by fire and war. His face was calm, his eyes hard as iron. Every scar told a story. In his hand he carried something wrapped in dark cloth. It dripped slowly, leaving a thin trail of crimson across the floor. The smell of blood filled the chamber. Sharp and undeniable, whispers spread among the council. Was it a weapon, a trap, or proof of the rumors they had laughed away? The human walked with no fear. He stood at the very center of the hall, right before the council's great table, and without a word he dropped the bundle. The cloth fell open, rolling across the stone, and there it was. Staring at them with dead, empty eyes, the severed head of the Supreme Overlord. Gasps filled the chamber. Some counselors recoiled. Others froze as if their very blood had turned to ice. The insectoid general who had shouted before stumbled back. His mandibles trembling, one of the reptilian lords hissed in terror. Impossible. The human did not speak. He simply stood there, his shadow long and dark against the glowing walls. His silence was louder than any voice. His presence was heavier than the weight of the Overlord's endless armies. The counselors could not comprehend what they saw. For centuries, the Supreme Overlord had been the symbol of eternal strength. He had conquered worlds, crushed rebellions, enslaved species. His power was legend, his cruelty unmatched, and yet his head now lay on their council floor. Carried by a single human, a whisper began among the youngest counselors. Quiet but dangerous. If one human could do this, what are the rest capable of? The words rippled across the chamber, turning whispers into fear, fear into silence, silence into dread. The human raised his eyes, staring into the faces of those who had ruled galaxies. He was not tall compared to them. He had no glowing aura, no weapons of great destruction, and yet not one dared move. Not one dared speak. For in that moment, every alien understood something they had denied for so long. Humans were not weak, they were not fragile. They were not to be dismissed. The silence stretched on. 1,000 thoughts filled the minds of the alien leaders. Was this the end of their reign? Was humanity about to rise? Or was this only the beginning of something far worse? The head of the Overlord rested on the cold stone, its lifeless gaze fixed on the council that had once obeyed its every word. It was more than a corpse, it was a message. And the message was clear: humanity had arrived. Whispers of defiance. The chamber of the Alien War Council remained frozen in heavy silence. But inside that silence, the minds of the counselors screamed with disbelief and fear. Every eye stayed locked on the severed head of the Supreme Overlord that rested on the stone floor, its lifeless gaze staring at them as if mocking their weakness. None of them had imagined that such a moment would ever come, for the Overlord had been considered invincible, eternal, a force that could bend galaxies to his will. Yet the truth was lying right before them, carried into their most sacred chamber by a single human. And this truth was more terrifying than any weapon of war. At first the fear was so thick that no one dared to move. But soon the whispers began. They were soft at first, little cracks in the silence, but they spread quickly like fire across dry grass. Some whispered that it must be a trick, a deception created by human technology. Others hissed that the severed head could not be real, that it was a clone or an illusion meant to weaken their courage. Yet none of them dared to touch it. None dared to step closer, for deep inside every heart they knew the truth. The Overlord was dead, and the one who had ended him was standing silently in front of them. The human did not speak. He remained still, his figure tall and unyielding beneath the light of the crystals that glowed from the chamber walls. His face was carved with scars, not of defeat, but of survival. Scars that spoke of countless battles fought not with infinite armies or fleets of ships, but with courage, pain, and human determination. That silence was his weapon, and it was cutting deeper than any blade could. Each second that passed with him standing in silence burned the hearts of the counselors, forcing them to face the truth they had always ignored. A reptilian warlord leaned forward, his scaled hands trembling slightly as he whispered to those beside him, "This is what happens when we underestimate them." One human walked into the fortress of the Overlord and returned alive, carrying what we thought was untouchable. His words carried fear, but also recognition. It was the first time in centuries that the Council spoke of humans not as insects to be crushed, but as something that could wound them, something dangerous, something they had never truly understood. The insectoid general, who had earlier mocked the idea of humans being strong, now found his mandibles twitching nervously. His eyes darted between the human and the head. He wanted to deny what he saw, to shout that this was impossible, but his body betrayed him. His claws clicked in fear, and the tremble in his voice showed weakness that no one had ever witnessed from him before. "If this is real," he whispered, "then everything we believed is broken. If a human can slay the Overlord, then none of us are safe." The whispers grew into arguments. Some shouted that the human must be executed immediately before others followed his path. They demanded that guards rush forward, but no one moved, not even the heavily armed protectors who lined the walls. They too had seen the head. They too felt the weight of the moment, and none dared to step closer, for something deep inside warned them that this was not a man to be touched lightly. Among the council, an elder alien with long silver skin and eyes that glowed like dying stars spoke softly. Yet every word carried through the chamber. "This is no trick," he said. "The Overlord is dead, and it was not by the power of fleets or empires. It was by the hand of one human, one fragile being that we thought was weaker than dust. And now we face a truth that shakes the very order of the galaxy." His voice trembled not with fear, but with awe, as if he saw in this human not just danger, but something far greater, something that even their ancient council could not control. The human finally lifted his gaze, his eyes cold but burning with a fire that none of them could look away from. He did not raise his voice, yet the weight of his silence crushed the chamber. He was a man surrounded by rulers of empires, yet he stood taller than all of them because he carried the one thing they had lost long ago: unbreakable will. The counselors realized with horror that they were no longer looking at a slave species, no longer staring at a weakling creature. They were looking at a force of nature wrapped in human flesh, a force that had changed the course of the galaxy. As the whispers of disbelief and fear spread, another realization began to grow like a shadow over the chamber. If one human could do this alone, what would happen if all of humanity rose together? What would happen if the billions of human voices that had been silenced, enslaved, and mocked for so long finally stood side by side? The counselors shifted nervously, for the thought itself was unbearable. For the first time in history, the most powerful beings in the galaxy were afraid not of a weapon, not of an empire, but of humanity itself. The whispers became the sound of defiance breaking apart. Some still clung to arrogance, shouting that humanity would be destroyed before it spread further, but many others sat in silence, their eyes darting between the human and the severed head of the Overlord. They knew what they could not say aloud. The age of the Overlord had ended, and the age of humanity had begun. The chamber was no longer just a place of power, it had become a witness to the moment that the galaxy would never forget. And in that moment, as whispers turned to silence once again, every alien understood that the lone human standing before them was not just a messenger. He was a warning, a promise, and a shadow of what was to come. The Overlord's fall. The silence of the council chamber seemed to stretch into eternity. Yet, in that silence, the mind of every alien turned to one burning question. How had this single human done it? How had he managed to succeed where whole fleets had failed? How had he entered the unbreakable fortress of the Supreme Overlord, slain the ruler who commanded the stars, and walked away carrying the severed head as proof? The truth of that story was more terrifying than the image itself, for it was not only the death of a tyrant, but the revelation of what humanity could endure. The human's silence lingered, but his eyes carried 1,000 unspoken words, and though he had not yet spoken aloud, the memory of his journey seemed to hang in the air like a storm waiting to break. He had not come to boast, he had not come to beg, he had come only to show them what had been done, but the truth could not be ignored. And slowly, the council began to imagine the events that had led to this moment. Each mind saw a different vision of the impossible, but the truth was far more brutal. The Overlord's fortress was a place of legend, forged into the core of a dead world where no light touched the surface. A palace of shadows and iron guarded by armies bred for loyalty, by machines that never slept, by assassins who struck without sound. Entire fleets had been destroyed just trying to reach its orbit, yet one human had slipped inside. Not with fleets, not with banners, but with nothing more than his will. His journey had begun in the shadows of the slave worlds where humanity had suffered for centuries. He had seen his people broken, his home burned, his children enslaved, and his rage had burned brighter than fear itself. He crept through the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the fortress, hunted at every step by beasts that had been bred to smell weakness and consume flesh. Many times he faced death in the darkness, but where others would have fallen, he endured. His body was scarred and bleeding, but his spirit pushed him onward. He fought guards with weapons torn from their own hands. He turned traps meant to kill him into paths that led him closer to his target. He endured hunger, thirst, and pain so deep that his bones felt like fire. Yet he refused to turn back, for he carried not only his own will, but the weight of every human who had been crushed under alien rule. When he reached the throne chamber of the Supreme Overlord, he faced not a ruler, but a monster of war. The Overlord was a being larger than life, armored in living metal, his body swollen with power. His very voice shook the walls when he laughed at the sight of a lone human. He mocked him, calling him fragile, weak, doomed. He promised to tear him apart piece by piece, to send his remains back to the humans as a warning. But the human did not tremble. He lifted the blade he had stolen from a fallen guard and stared into the burning eyes of the Overlord. And in that moment he carried the strength of 1,000 broken worlds. The battle was not fair, it was fury against endurance. It was cruelty against will. The Overlord struck with blows that shattered stone, his roars echoing across the chamber like thunder, yet the human moved like shadow and fire. Every strike that should have ended him only drove him deeper into the fight. His ribs cracked, his blood spilled across the ground. But he rose again and again. The Overlord had never faced such defiance, never faced an enemy who would not stay down. For in every human breath there was defiance. In every step there was resistance. The fight lasted through the night, until the chamber was painted with the blood of both warrior and tyrant. And when the Overlord raised his weapon for the final strike, the human met him not with fear, but with fire. With a final surge of will, he drove his blade through the heart of the monster who had enslaved his people. The Overlord screamed, his power shaking the world itself. But it was too late. His strength faltered, his body fell, and in one swift motion the human severed his head. A silence followed, a silence that no alien in the galaxy had ever imagined would come. The supreme overlord, the conqueror of stars, was dead by the hands of one human. The human did not shout his victory. He did not carve his name into the walls. He simply picked up the head, heavy and lifeless, and began his long journey out of the fortress. Every corridor that had once been filled with guards now echoed with silence. Every beast that had once guarded the halls now lay dead at his feet. He left no fleet to greet him, no army to celebrate. Only his shadow stretched long across the burning ground as he walked away, carrying the proof of what had been done. And now, in the chamber of the council, that proof lay before the galaxy's rulers. A reminder that no fortress is too strong, no ruler too mighty, no empire too eternal when faced with the relentless will of humanity. The story of the Overlord's fall was not only the tale of one man's victory. It was the revelation that humanity's strength was not in numbers, nor in weapons, but in the unyielding spirit that refused to kneel. The counselors trembled as they imagined the battle, for they understood that if a single human could endure all of that and still rise, then the galaxy itself would tremble when all of humanity stood together. The severed head was not just a trophy, it was a message carved in blood and fire. It was a warning that the age of alien dominion was ending, and a new age was about to begin. Humanity had slain the monster that had ruled for centuries, and the galaxy would never be the same. Alien reactions. The Chamber of the War Council had witnessed wars declared, treaties broken, and worlds sentenced to death. Yet never in its long history had it been as shaken as it was now. The severed head of the Supreme Overlord lay like a dark sun in the middle of the council floor, its lifeless eyes staring into eternity, a reminder of the impossible act that had just been proven real. Around it, the counselors sat, beings of immense age and power, their faces carved with fear and disbelief. Some sat frozen, their bodies trembling as if every muscle refused to obey, while others turned to their neighbors, whispering frantically, searching for answers that no one could give. One of the reptilian lords, his scales blackened with ceremonial paint, hissed in a voice that cracked under terror, "This cannot stand. If a human could do this, then what are we facing? What are we to become?" His words were not of confidence but of desperation. He had seen entire rebellions crushed by the Overlord's hand, had seen mighty empires bow in silence, and now that very hand had been severed by a creature his kind had mocked for centuries. His tongue flicked nervously, his eyes darting toward the human who still stood silently in the center of the hall. The weight of that gaze alone was enough to silence him. Across the table, the insectoid general who had once boasted of human weakness now struggled to keep his composure. His claws clattered against the surface of the table, clicking in a rhythm that betrayed the storm inside him. He wanted to rise, to command the guards, to order the human executed before more damage could be done. Yet when his multifaceted eyes turned toward the human, his voice died in his throat. For he saw not a frail creature but a presence that radiated something he could not understand. The human had no armies, no fleets, no divine weapons, yet he carried something far greater. He carried the undeniable truth of victory, and that truth was heavier than any threat the council had ever faced. Others began to shout in panic, their voices rising in a cacophony of fear. One cried out that this was the beginning of the end. Another demanded that humanity be exterminated before they spread further. A third pounded the table with a trembling fist, shouting that the council had grown weak, that they had allowed themselves to fear the face of one man. But even as these words were thrown into the chamber, none dared to rise. None dared to step toward the human who remained still as a statue. The silence of his defiance was stronger than their roars. Amid the storm of fear, an elder rose from his seat. His body was ancient, his skin stretched thin and glowing faintly under the light of the crystals. His voice was low yet clear, cutting through the chaos like a blade through smoke. "You fools," he said, "this is not a question of extermination, nor of denial. This is a question of survival. Look into the eyes of this human, and you will see what we all have ignored. They do not fight because they are strong. They fight because they cannot be broken. If one man could do this alone, imagine what his kind could do if united. His words struck deeper than any threat, for they carried not just wisdom but prophecy. The council chamber wavered between silence and chaos. Some shook their heads, refusing to believe, clinging to the old lies that humans were nothing but dust in the void. Yet deep down, even they felt the crack of fear spreading through their hearts. Others sat quietly, their expressions unreadable, already calculating what alliances could be forged. What choices must be made before it was too late? For the fall of the Overlord did not only mean the death of one ruler, it meant the collapse of a balance that had lasted for centuries. And in that collapse, every empire would be forced to choose. The guards who stood along the walls shifted uneasily. Their weapons remained at their sides, but their eyes betrayed their thoughts. These were warriors bred to obey without hesitation. Yet they had seen the head, smelled the blood, and felt the weight of the human's presence. None of them moved, not because they feared punishment, but because something deep inside told them that to strike now would be to strike against the tide of history itself. They were soldiers, but even they knew when a battle was already lost. The reptilian lord who had spoken earlier now slumped in his chair, his claws digging into the wood. "We cannot allow them to rise," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "If they rise, we will all fall." Yet, even as he spoke, doubt cracked through his words. His mind showed him images of human defiance, of human endurance, of a species that had survived death worlds and endless wars. And he knew his warning was already too late. Humanity had already risen. The human finally moved, just slightly, lifting his chin and letting his gaze sweep across the chamber. He did not speak, yet every alien felt as if he had shouted into their minds. The message was clear. Humanity had endured chains, fire, and despair, and now they stood unbroken before the greatest council in the galaxy. They were not asking for permission. They were not begging for mercy. They were declaring themselves in silence. One by one, the councilors lowered their eyes. Some clenched their fists in anger, others trembled in fear, but none could deny the truth any longer. The galaxy had changed in a single moment, and it would never return to what it once was. The Overlord's severed head was not just the end of one tyrant. It was the beginning of an age where humanity's spirit would haunt every decision, every battle, every whisper in the stars, and so the chamber that had once echoed with arrogance now drowned in silence and dread. Each alien leader struggled with the same thought. Should they crush humanity before it spread? Or should they bow before a strength that could not be measured in fleets and weapons? The choice was clear, yet unbearable. For either path led to a future where humanity would not be ignored. Humanity had become the shadow in every heart, the fire in every fear, and the storm that no empire could stop. Humanity's declaration. The chamber of the War Council remained heavy with silence. Yet it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of fear, of realization, of shattered arrogance. The severed head of the Supreme Overlord still lay in the center of the hall, its lifeless eyes staring blankly as though mocking the council that had once trembled before its commands. Around it, the alien leaders sat frozen, uncertain whether to scream, to flee, or to kneel. They had always believed themselves the masters of the galaxy, rulers of fate. But now the balance of power was breaking before their eyes, and it was being broken not by fleets or empires, but by the presence of one human. For long moments the man had said nothing, allowing the weight of silence to crush the chamber. Yet when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and unshaken. It was not the booming voice of a conqueror, nor the cold hiss of a tyrant. It was simple, almost quiet, but it carried across the chamber like thunder. "I did not come here to beg for mercy," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "I did not come here to ask for peace. I came to deliver a message." Every alien leaned forward, their hearts pounding, for they had expected threats. But what came was far worse. The human pointed to the Overlord's severed head. "This is the fate of any who believe humanity will kneel," he declared. His voice did not rise, yet it echoed across the crystal walls, lingering in the air. "We have been called weak. fragile, insignificant. For centuries you enslaved us, mocked us, treated us as nothing, and still we endured. You burned our homes, yet we rebuilt. You shackled our people, yet we broke our chains. You sent us to die on your death worlds, yet we survived. Do you understand now? We do not endure because we are strong. We endure because we refuse to die. The words struck the counselors harder than any weapon. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, for in the human's voice there was no plea, no attempt to gain their approval. It was truth, raw and undeniable. Spoken with the certainty of a species that had been tempered in fire, a massive amphibian overlord growled low, his massive chest heaving with unease. "You dare threaten us," he muttered, but his words lacked strength. The human turned his gaze toward him, eyes burning not with hatred but with defiance. "I do not threaten," he said. "I promise," whispers rippled across the chamber. Some counselors hissed that this human was dangerous, that his species must be wiped out before it was too late. Others remained silent, their faces pale, for they had seen the head, they had seen the proof. The overlord who had ruled for centuries was gone, and if one human could accomplish such a thing, then extermination was no longer certain. Victory against humanity was no longer guaranteed. The galaxy itself had shifted, and now every empire would have to face the question of what humanity would become. The human stepped forward, each footstep echoing across the polished floor like the toll of a bell. His presence filled the chamber more than any army could. He stood before the council table, his voice firm. "We do not seek conquest. We do not seek to rule your stars. Humanity asks only one thing, that we live free, that we choose our own path, that we bow to no master." His words rang with finality, and for a moment the chamber was silent once more. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping lower, yet somehow it carried with even greater weight. "But hear this clearly," he said, his eyes sharp as steel. "If you come for us again, if you try to enslave us, if you think we will bend, then remember the Overlord. Remember what I carry to you today. His fate will be your fate, and his fall will be your fall. Humanity does not break. Humanity does not kneel." The declaration was not a speech of ambition. It was not a demand for power or tribute. It was a warning carved into the soul of the galaxy, a line drawn in blood and fire. The aliens understood this was no empty threat. For centuries they had believed humanity's spirit was a weakness, that their short lives made them desperate and powerless. Yet now they saw that very spirit was what made them unyielding, what made them eternal, not in years, but in will. The reptilian lord who had been most vocal earlier could not stop his trembling. His claws scratched against the table as he whispered, "If one human can do this, then what happens if they unite? What happens if they rise together?" His words were not meant for the chamber, but everyone heard, and the thought spread through the council like poison. For the galaxy had always survived on balance, empires rising and falling, powers shifting, but humanity was something new, something no one could measure. If one man could cut down the Overlord, then what could billions do? The human's eyes scanned the council, and for a brief moment each alien felt exposed, as though he was not speaking to them as rulers, but as prey. They could feel the unspoken truth in his gaze. Humanity would not seek war, but they would not run from it either. If pushed, they would fight with the fury of 1,000 storms, and the galaxy, no matter how vast, would never forget the cost. For the first time in ages, the council was no longer debating among themselves, no longer arguing about policies or conquests. They were staring into the face of change. They were listening to a declaration that would echo across the stars. The Overlord's head was the proof, but the human's words were the prophecy. Humanity had declared itself free. Humanity had declared itself unbroken. And nothing in the galaxy could undo what had been said. The shift of power. The declaration still hung in the air of the council chamber like a storm that refused to pass. The words of the human were not the words of an empire. They were not threats thrown by a conqueror. They were not pleas made by a desperate race. They were a promise and that promise weighed heavier than the Overlord's severed head around the great table. The alien leaders struggled to breathe under the crushing reality of what they had just witnessed. The galaxy had shifted, and every leader present could feel the ground slipping beneath their feet. The insectoid general who had once mocked humanity now sat with his claws trembling uncontrollably. His many eyes darted from the head on the floor to the silent human standing before them. He had commanded fleets that could blot out the stars. He had seen empires bow with a single command. Yet never in his long years had he felt such weakness in his own body. His people had always believed strength was measured in size, in weapons, in armies. But this human had shattered that belief in a single act, and the general now realized that true strength was measured in will, and in that will humanity was unmatched. Others in the chamber began to whisper to one another. Their words were filled with fear, but also calculation. Some spoke of extermination, still clinging to the idea that humanity could be crushed before it spread further. Yet their voices shook, for deep inside they knew the truth. Humanity had already spread, not with fleets or armies, but with the weight of its defiance. Humanity had spread into the minds of every ruler now seated at this table. Their fear was not of ships or weapons, but of the knowledge that no matter what they did, humans would rise again and again. A massive amphibian overlord leaned forward, his golden eyes fixed on the human. His voice was low and rough, but beneath the sound of anger there was something else. Hesitation. If your kind truly rises, if they spread across the stars united, then this council will not survive, he muttered. The human did not flinch. He did not even blink. His silence was louder than any roar. It told them all that humanity had already made its choice, and the only question left was whether the galaxy would stand against them or beside them. For centuries, the council had lived under the shadow of the supreme Overlord. He had been the unifying fear, the ruler who kept order through terror. Now that shadow was gone, and the council found itself exposed. Divisions that had been buried under the Overlord's power began to rise. Some counselors whispered that they could ally with humanity, that they could learn from them. Others hissed that such thoughts were treason. Yet even as they argued, the truth became clearer with every passing moment. The Overlord's death was not simply the end of one ruler. It was the beginning of a new age where power would not be measured by ancient bloodlines or endless fleets, but by the spirit that refused to kneel. The elder who had spoken earlier now raised his voice once again. His words were calm but carried with them the weight of centuries. "Do you not see," he said, "the age of fear has ended. The age of endurance has begun. This human does not come as a conqueror. He comes as a messenger of what is to come. If we do not understand this now, then the stars themselves will remind us. Humanity cannot be erased. Humanity cannot be bent. They are the fire that spreads no matter how much water you pour, and we must decide if we will stand in its path or stand beside its light." His words struck the chamber deeply, for though many still feared humanity, they could no longer deny the truth of his vision. The reptilian lord slammed his fist against the table, scales cracking under the force. "This is madness," he shouted. "We cannot allow insects to dictate the fate of the galaxy. If we bow to them, we are finished." But even as he spoke, his voice shook. His words rang hollow, for he had already seen the future reflected in the human's eyes. He knew his protest was not a declaration of strength, but a cry of desperation. And the others knew it too, for none of them echoed his roar. The human remained motionless, yet his presence pulled at the chamber like gravity itself. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to shout or demand. His very existence in that place was enough to tip the scales. The severed head of the Overlord was the proof of what he had said, and the silence of the council proved that they believed him. The shift had already begun. The galaxy's most powerful council was no longer united in arrogance. It was divided between fear and awe, and humanity stood at the center of that divide. In the corners of the chamber, whispers grew into plans. Some spoke of betrayal, of striking humanity before they grew stronger. Others whispered of alliances, of reaching out before it was too late. But every plan was born not from strength, but from fear. The galaxy's rulers who had once enslaved humanity now plotted their survival against it, and that alone showed how much the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, the alien leaders began to imagine themselves in chains. They saw visions of human fleets rising, of human soldiers walking into their palaces as this man had walked into the council. They saw themselves kneeling, begging for mercy from the very species they had once mocked, and that vision burned in their hearts like fire. The human finally turned his back to them, not in arrogance but in quiet certainty. His steps echoed as he began to walk away, leaving the severed head on the cold stone floor. The counselors did not rise, they did not shout, they sat frozen, watching him go, and in their silence was the admission of a truth they could not speak aloud. The galaxy's center of power had shifted, and it would never shift back. The age of the Overlord was dead. The age of humanity had begun. The final silence. The chamber that had always been the beating heart of galactic power now felt like a tomb. The air was thick, not with the roar of authority, but with the weight of silence that pressed down on every creature seated at the table. Where once declarations of war and conquest had echoed, now there was only the sound of a single man's footsteps retreating into the distance. Each step he took away from the council table seemed to hammer deeper into the minds of the alien rulers, reminding them that their world had changed forever. They had sat as gods for centuries, untouchable and absolute. But in the space of a single meeting, they had been reduced to spectators of their own downfall. The severed head of the Supreme Overlord still lay on the cold stone floor, its gaze fixed into eternity. It no longer radiated power or control. Instead, it had become a symbol of weakness, of vulnerability, of the arrogance that had blinded them all. The counselors who once bowed to it could no longer bring themselves to look directly at it, for every glance reminded them that their age of dominance had ended. The head was no longer the face of their ruler, it was the crown of humanity's defiance, placed before them not as a gift, but as a warning. The human did not look back as he walked away. His silence was heavier than any speech he could have made. He had not asked for tribute. He had not demanded oaths. He had not come to conquer. Yet his presence had conquered more than armies ever could. He had conquered fear itself, planting it deep within the hearts of every ruler in that chamber. His declaration still echoed that humanity would not kneel, that humanity would not break. It was not spoken as ambition, but as truth, and truth carried farther than threats ever could. As the heavy doors of the chamber slowly closed behind him, the echoes of his departure lingered like the tolling of a great bell. One by one, the counselors turned their eyes toward one another, but no words came. For the first time in centuries, they had no commands, no decrees, no answers. They were leaders of galaxies, yet they were left in silence, powerless before the will of a single man. That silence grew heavier, pressing down on their shoulders until they could hardly breathe. Some tried to speak, their voices weak and trembling. A reptilian lord muttered about extermination, about striking humanity before their fire spread too far, but his voice faltered before he could finish. For deep inside he knew the thought was already meaningless. If one man could enter the fortress of the Overlord and leave with his head, then what hope was there in extermination? No fleet was large enough to crush a will that would never die. Others whispered of alliances, of bending the knee to humanity before humanity forced them to. But even those whispers faded, for none of them wanted to admit that their power had been reduced to begging. The elder with the glowing eyes closed his gaze and spoke softly. "The stars have shifted," he said. "We sit here as if we still rule them, but today we have seen the truth. Humanity is not weak, humanity is not fragile. They are the storm that will sweep across the galaxy. We can stand against them, but in doing so we will fall. Or we can stand beside them and survive." His voice carried no arrogance, only the weight of history, and the others could not deny the truth of his words. The silence thickened once more, for the counselors knew that no decision they made tonight would matter. The decision had already been made. Not by them, but by the lone human who had entered their chamber with nothing but scars and defiance. Humanity had already carved its place into the stars, and no empire, no ruler, no war could erase it. The galaxy had been forced to witness a truth it had long denied, that the spirit of humanity was stronger than chains, stronger than armies, stronger than fear itself. The guards along the walls remained frozen in place. Their weapons stayed at their sides, but their eyes betrayed what they felt. They had been bred for loyalty, raised to protect the council without question. But in their hearts they knew that even if they had attacked, even if they had thrown themselves upon the human, nothing would have changed. They had witnessed history, and to raise a weapon against it would have been as foolish as trying to fight the tide. The insectoid general finally lowered his head, claws trembling as he whispered to no one in particular. "We have feared the wrong enemy all this time," he said. His words were bitter but true. For centuries they had fought rival empires, rebel fleets, insurgent armies, yet none of those had ever threatened their power as much as one man had in a single day. The counselors who heard him did not answer, but none disagreed. The chamber that had once been filled with arrogance now became filled with dread. Every leader present saw the same vision in their minds, a future where humans stood tall, where humans spread across the stars, unyielding and unbroken. They saw themselves not as rulers but as witnesses, forced to watch as a new power rose from the ashes of their arrogance. Some would resist, some would conspire, but all of them knew the truth could not be changed. Humanity had become the center of the galaxy's story, and nothing would erase that. When the final echoes of the humans' footsteps faded beyond the doors, the silence that followed was deeper than any the chamber had ever known. Not a whisper dared to break it. Not a word dared to challenge it. The council sat in stillness, their eyes shifting nervously toward the severed head that stared back at them. And though none of them admitted it aloud, each one knew that the true gaze watching them was not the dead overlords, but the living fire of humanity. That silence was more than fear. It was surrender. It was the acknowledgement that the galaxy had changed. The old order had fallen with the overlord's head, and a new one had risen with the footsteps of a human who carried nothing but defiance. The silence of that chamber would echo across the stars, remembered in whispers and legends, retold in every corner of the galaxy and in every retelling. The message would remain the same. One human had entered the War Council, carrying the Overlord's severed head, and in doing so, he had changed the galaxy forever.